one striking photo inside was of an electric flashlight illuminating a woman holding her dead child killed in the bombing campaign. That image, a woman in desperation, would become the key subject of the Guernica painting. Buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches, and buenas anything else you'd like to mention. And welcome to the Hispanophiles Podcast, Travel in Spain with Only Half a Brain. This is the only podcast to have won Olympic gold in the 200-metre siesta. My name is James Bruffery, aka Peter Pan con Tomate, and cutting straight to the point, today's episode is a bit of a serious one. We are looking at the story of Guernica. This is the timeline of the unprovoked aerial bombing of an entire civilian town during the Spanish Civil War that compelled Pablo Picasso to create his eponymous magnus opus in 1937 that did more than any other piece of published media ever in history to bring the savagery of Franco's military tactics to global attention. Yes, quite a heavy one today. We will avoid wasting too much time on interpretations of the artwork and of its contents, which could be an entire separate episode by itself, and we're going to be looking more at the context and sequence of events that led to its creation in 1937. Does that sound reasonable? Let's go and do it. But first, of course, we have to start with our regular podcast segments, and we're beginning this week with the Spanish vocabulary of the week. And that is hacer una carambola. Hacer una carambola. Now, a bit of a complicated one, but this is something I learned in my office recently, speaking to a couple of colleagues. And it's one of those things where, in the back of my mind, I realised that for a while, I thought, oh yeah, I never knew how to say that, or how to express that. Más bien dicho. Hacer una carambola. A carom is a fruit. That apparently is related to the parsley, even though it looks nothing like parsley as I know it, whose fruit can be consumed when dried as like a little sort of powdery, herby, spice type thing. And that's a carom. A carambola, so caram and then bola, is the move you would call a cannon in English in the UK when you're playing billiards or pool. So basically to strike the ball as hard as possible against an opposite cushion to bring it back and then strike the ball you're looking to hit and get it into the hole. That's a carambola. So hacer una carambola is to strike the ball in a completely different direction, get it back, and then achieve the outcome that you wanted with a little more luck than judgment. And that gives a clue as to what hacer una carambola colloquially actually means when used in Spanish. It is the Spanish phrase for to fluke. F-L-U-K-E, a fluke. Una carambola, a fluke, hacer una carambola, to fluke. A very typically British colloquialism for when you essentially, the action was done with very little judgment or skill, but the outcome was exactly what you wanted, even though you probably didn't deserve the outcome. That's what in the UK we call a fluke. In Spanish, hacer una carambola is basically to just smack the pool cue against the ball. It hits the opposite cushion, rebounds, and gets the ball you were looking to get into the hole. A fluke, if I ever heard one. I didn't realise I needed to learn that, but I did recently, and I wanted to throw it into the episode this week for you guys. Hacer una carambola, to fluke your way out or into a situation. We will proceed with our second regular segment, which is, of course, the Spanish news story of the week. Or better said, of last year, 2025, at time of recording. 3 men were discovered attempting to enter Spain illegally. They were stopped in Algeria, and the customs officials, the border patrol, discovered them disguised as sheep. Their ploy, basically, what they'd done is they'd wrapped their entire torsos in cotton-like padding and painted their faces and limbs black, basically to resemble the sort of sheep you would find in Wallace and Gromit, A Close Shave, one of those Shaun the Sheep type ones. They'd crouched down amongst other sheep. This was a truck full of sheep being transported, I guess, to an abattoir, I don't really know. And the men had decided to wrap them up in padding, paint their extremities black, and crouch down amongst the sheep. Border officers noticed unusual behaviour among some of the animals, some of the livestock that they were inspecting, took a closer look with the torches and discovered 3 men trying to cross the border illegally. An amusing story, I guess, something I read recently in the news. that tickled me a little bit. I guess I applaud the ingenuity, the creativity of what they were trying to achieve. We have covered our 2 regular segments, so now we move on to the main talking point of this episode. And if you're new to the Hispanophiles podcast, whenever we turn our attention to a big topic that requires a lot of research, we start by outlining which literature has helped us significantly in the preparation of the content. Today, the books I would like to mention: Hell and Good Company by Richard Rhodes, published by Simon & Schuster; España, A Brief History of Spain by Giles Tremlett, published by Head of Zeus; The Penguin History of Modern Spain by Nigel Townsend, published by, you guessed it, Penguin; and The Basque History of the World by Mark Wolanski, published by Vintage. Another very useful source in the preparation of this episode was pablopicasso.org. So, to Guernica we turn our attention. The most basic question we can ask is, what do we mean by Guernica? It is an oil painting, 3.5 metres tall and 7.8 metres wide, created by Pablo Picasso in 1937. It is arguably his most famous work ever, his magnus opus, as I described in the intro. I certainly agree with this, and I think it is not too far-fetched to say that it is one of his works that had the strongest cultural impact, beyond the regular art circles who are interested in Cubism and his work. June 1937, it was commissioned for the Spanish Pavilion at the Paris World Fair, which ran until November, showing Guernica as part of its exhibitions. Pablo Picasso was living in Paris at the time, therefore he was an obvious candidate to go for, as Spain was in the early stages of the Civil War. Now, Guernica, the art piece, is on display at the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid. The first few decades of life, it was on display in many countries after the Paris World Fair closed, but was on display for longest prior to the 80s at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. It moved back to democratic Spain in 1981, which was one of Picasso's wishes, that the piece should be on display outside of the country until Franco died and the country of his birth became democratic. Pablo himself died in 1973, thus never saw this wish played out before his eyes. But why is Guernica so significant? It is the artistic expression of Pablo Picasso's disgust at the unprovoked bombing of Guernica, the town. Guernica, that's the Castilian spelling of the name. Gernika is the Basque spelling of the name. Yes, this is a small town in the Basque country, 30 kilometers east of Bilbao. It is a small market town in Biscay province. Founded originally in 1366, it was a meeting point for the Basque parish general assemblies for centuries, and the elders of rural Biscayan society communities, they would meet regularly in Guernica beneath its famous oak tree to discuss important civil and public matters. The Guernica oak tree, the Guernicaco arbola in euskadi, this tree being so important to the Basque history, Basque culture, that the town Guernica holds quite a lot of symbolic weight in the Basque cultural identity and self-definition. In fact, Athletic Club Bilbao used to have a graphic representation of the tree of Guernica inside its original badge, going back quite a few decades now. In 1937, most of the buildings were made of stone bases and foundations, but from the first floor upwards, most of the buildings were made of wood, which, as I'm hoping you're aware, burns quite easily, something which will become relevant shortly. And the population of Guernica was about 7,000 when it was attacked on April 26, 1937, by Franco's air forces, who were using aircraft given to him on credit by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy during the Spanish Civil War. The civilian death toll is unknown. It will never be known. It's one of those things we can only speculate and use judgment and a bit of research and, unfortunately, inconsistent and shaky eyewitness accounts to try and estimate. Some people think it was over 4 figures, but we just don't know, and we never shall. So we know it's a painting, we know it's Basque, we know the symbolic weight of the town in question, we know the destruction and the death toll was very, very high, we know who to blame for the attack, and we also know who painted the painting that made it a landmark cultural moment and military and political in Spain. How did this happen? Well, we have to do something that I've been promising myself to do for a long time in this podcast. We got to episode 32 before I turn my attention to the Spanish Civil War. Now, I will say at this stage, number one, it's something that I think many other podcasts, writers, books, blogs, news outlets, you name it, it's been done very well elsewhere by people who have conducted a greater amount of historical research than I have, and by people who are more qualified to talk about the Spanish Civil War than I am. Long story short, I want to do more research, read more, feed my mind and my understanding of the conflicts before I create a full episode dedicated to the Falanges, to Franco, and to the Civil War. However, to tell the story of this painting, I need to look at the Civil War first. It began with a nationalist rebel insurgency. The objective was very, very simple: to depose the left-wing Republican government, to institute authoritarian rule free of corrupting foreign ideologies, quote-unquote, with Catholicism as a centrepiece of the national identity. Those are the words of Nigel Townsend in the Penguin History Book of Modern Spain. 18th of July 1936, the coup began in Melilla. A small reminder that Spain is the only European nation-state to still maintain territories and possessions on the African continent. One of those is Ceuta, the other is Melilla. Strictly speaking, Melilla saw its revolts on the evening of the 17th, the next day, at 5 p.m, aka the 17th at 17, and the government's delegate in Melilla had been alerted by the Ministry of Interior of military and right-wing groups preparing an uprising against the state. Now, insufficient action was taken on the 17th, and by the 18th it was very clear what was happening, and the action actually began. Another proviso I'd like to make at this point: in this episode, I'm going to avoid as much as possible, and wherever makes sense, the use of the word fascist. In my personal opinion, in a lot of online content and in a lot of political discourse, right now the word is used frivolously and often incorrectly, more than anything else, just to describe someone you disagree with, who you do not want to listen to. Now, it would not be inaccurate to describe Franco and the Falange Party as fascist, but, like I said, the word nowadays has taken on an almost partisan quality in the us versus them kind of mentality. This, I want to avoid it because I feel I could be very easily misconstrued in its use of it by people online. So that's one small thing I wanted to raise at this stage. We will move on. I will generally be using the words nationalists, insurgents, and rebels instead of the word fascist, but I'm basically referring to that side of the conflict. Factions and rifts within the military prevented this uprising from being dealt with quickly. 46,000 soldiers apparently stayed loyal to the Republic, whereas 45,000 aligned themselves with this rebel force, with this uprising. But only 4 out of 24 major generals in the Spanish army were involved proactively and sympathetically in this coup, 2 of whom were Emilio Mola and Francisco Franco. The Civil Guard and the Assault Guard, generally speaking, remained loyal to the Republic during the coup, and most of the Navy and Air Force personnel in Spain at the time remained loyal to the Republic in 1936. 230 of the Spanish planes available remained under control of the Republic, compared to about 100 that were available for use by the rebels at this stage. Like I said, the uprising began in Melilla, but quickly spread to many other cities on the Spanish mainland. By the end of the 18th, areas where the uprising was taking place and effective, the Canary Islands, the Spanish territories in North Africa, like Melilla, for example. There were garrisons in Sevilla, Córdoba, Granada, Cádiz, places in Andalusia that saw a lot of ground made by the insurgents. On the 19th, the next day, military soldiers marched into Barcelona, the Catalan capital. They were defeated by the local police and armed civilians who remained loyal to the Republic for a long time in the case of Barcelona. And on the 20th, exactly the same thing happened in Madrid. The government panicked, and Francisco Largo Caballero took over as the Republican Prime Minister in the aftermath of the nationalist uprisings in July 1936. In 1 week, the rebels held Sevilla, Córdoba, Cádiz, Granada, Cáceres, Navarra, most of Galicia, most of Castilla y León, and half of Aragon, including the big city Zaragoza. But the Republic held a lot of the key assets and industries that were necessary ahead of a conflict. Those include the gold reserves of the country, most agricultural land and export crops, places that were needed to feed a large population at war, most manufacturing spaces, mineral reserves, particularly in the Basque region, worthy of note, and the bulk of Navy and Air Force assets, as previously mentioned. Franco indeed led the Army of Africa, and they were 34,000 strong, very disciplined and trained soldiers, but they were located in Africa. They were not actually in Spain yet. Thus, at this stage, at the end of July 1936, it was difficult to see how the Republic were not going to be able to defeat this rebel insurgency. It had all the resources, it had most land, and it had a lot of popular support. What made the difference, what tipped the scales, was foreign intervention. At the outbreak of civil war in Spain, a non-intervention agreement was signed by dignitaries from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and the USSR in September 1936. This is something that most of those nations would do a terrible job of respecting. Britain and France largely kept out of the conflict. Portugal did intervene with limited involvement, but the other three did involve themselves far more directly in the Spanish Civil War. The National Socialists in Germany and the Fascists in Italy, they wanted to halt the potential spread of communism in Europe. They also wanted to break Britain and France's stronghold on the Straits of Gibraltar. And Germany in particular was eyeing up a lot of the useful minerals and resources in Spain that it wanted to get for itself in its own armament prior to World War II. Furthermore, another reason for Germany getting involved was the fact that high command in that country favoured Franco's drawn-out approach to war that led to a war of attrition. They were perfectly happy with Franco as long as possible, causing havoc, costing lives, smashing down buildings, and diverting global media attention away from what was going on in Germany. Again, the Third Reich was busy arming itself ahead of its own fairly major military campaign. I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. Thus, Germany and Italy, in particular, contributed materially to the rebel insurgency in the Spanish Civil War from day one. That came in the form, more than anything else, of soldiers, of feet on the ground, but also a lot of military hardware. Mussolini sent on credit to the insurgents, to the rebels, 500 cannons, 700 mortars, 12,000 machine guns, 3,800 motor vehicles, i.e. trucks and jeeps and things, 130 planes. In total, during the Spanish Civil War, Italy sent 50,000 soldiers to fight. I will say there's different sources I looked at in the preparation of this script quoted a different figure. The very highest number I saw was 75,000, but more or less 50,000 was the median, which is why I quoted that. But 6,000 Italian troops did land in Cadiz on the 22nd of December 1936. Merry Christmas, lads. Going back a little bit, on the 28th of July 36, 12 Savoia SM-81s left Italian airspace, headed for Morocco, 2 of which crashed at sea, 1 of which had to perform an emergency landing in French Morocco, and the arrival of this Italian fighter plane in French territory is what alerted the rest of the world to Italy's attempt to provide resources directly to the rebel cause in Spain. But the other 9 Savoyas arrived in Spanish-held Morocco. July 25th, a few days earlier, Hitler had met with emissaries representing Franco in Bavaria, in the south of Germany. Franco requested transport to bring 34,000 of his men from Morocco to the Spanish mainland, and although there was a degree of reluctance among some people within the German high command, ultimately Hitler was in a good mood that day, and he said yes. The Condor Legion of the Luftwaffe was sent to assist Franco, and therefore, in 1936, the biggest airlift in terms of number of people transported by plane the world had ever seen took place, getting those 34,000 soldiers to the Spanish mainland. It was nicknamed Operation Magic Fire, inspired by Richard Wagner's Siegfried opera that Hitler had been watching that very night, which is one of the reasons why, apparently, he was in a good mood. 20 Junker Ju-52s were sent to assist the 9 Italian Savoyas that had landed. The the first of which arrived on the 27th of July. These were the vehicles that airlifted Franco's Army of Africa to the Spanish mainland. The naval force also brought 1,600 men, and Franco himself arrived on the Spanish mainland on the 6th of August 1936. Thus, after having been in a position of inferiority with regards to likelihood of victory, German and Italian help meant that all of a sudden the rebels had a core group of trained professional soldiers that began to outform units of Republican forces they were coming up against. Basically, they just began butchering resistance in such brutal manners wherever they went, going from south and just spreading outward, basically. In 30 days, this Army of Africa, these new rebel forces, supplemented by Italian and German soldiers and hardware, covered 432 kilometres in 30 days. It was an incredible front against the Republic. By November, the rebels were closing in on Madrid, and the Republican government, fearing attack, fled to Valencia. But then the final two months of 1936, the international brigades began to arrive to support Republican fighters. The total number of international brigade fighters across the conflict was 41,000, and they suffered a 15% mortality rate, higher than the mortality rate of Spaniards fighting for the Republic prior to the end of the war. But that was comparable to the mortality rate of foreigners, i.e. Italians and Germans, predominantly serving in the rebel ranks. One other nation that had an interest in the Spanish Civil War was the Soviet Union, the USSR. Apart from Mexico, who did a bit of financing and supply some arms, as well as hosting refugees from Spain, from the Republic I should say, the USSR was the only key player in Eurasia to back the Republic in any meaningful way. They sent Soviet tanks, aircraft, munitions, arms, staff. The USSR needed to show it could stand up to a fascist threat in Europe if it were to win friends and gain more influence. And it also wanted to avoid ally France being surrounded by fascist powers. Now, Russia saw France as an ally more than vice versa, and it was eager to try and butter up its neighbour in anticipation of German aggressive military expansion, which of course is exactly what happened. So the USSR got involved, but the quality of the German and Italian hardware was vastly superior to what the Soviets were giving the Republicans. That being said, at the end few months of 1936, the Spanish Civil War began to enter a bit of a stalemate. From November to March, the rebel attacks on Madrid were consistently thwarted. It became a siege, quite a tough one for those living in Madrid, but they held out. This prompted a change of strategy for the rebels, who were being increasingly disheartened by their failure to get Madrid. Looking for a morale-boosting victory, the rebel insurgency abandoned the siege on Madrid and turned their attention to the Republican-held Vizcaya province in the Basque Country. Now, the Basque Country, one of my favourite parts of Spain. We'll talk a little bit now about Basque culture and identity and its political ramifications at the beginning of the 20th century. That era, late 19th, early 20th century, was the era of the Basque Renaissance. This was led by thinkers like Sabino Arana, known as the godfather of Basque nationalism, and Miguel de Unamuno, one of Spain's leading intellectuals of the early 20th century, a man of phenomenal talent and intellect. He spoke like 8 languages or something crazy. The Basque language was flourishing along with the economy at the time. In 1918, the Basque Academy of Language was founded with an aim of codifying and unifying euskadi between the 8 different dialects spoken around what is known as the Basque region, including the parts of France where Basque is and was spoken. Very little euskadi was written down before the 19th century, which made this more complicated. Bilbao province in particular was a destination of migration from people from Spain, and this created a lot of tensions between the Basques in Vizcaya province and what they described as maquetos, the economic migrants from other parts of Spain who could not speak Basque and who looked very different to the Basques themselves. The importance of Vizcaya province in particular: half of Spain's iron and 3/4 of Spain's steel come from here, and therefore it was viewed with very hungry eyes. In 1931, there was actually little Basque support for the Spanish Republic. Catholic practice has always been very widespread across euskadi, across the Basque country, and the Republic was seen, or at least its leaders and its champions, were seen as too socialist and therefore too anti-church for Basque tastes. But the Basque nationalists and the Carlists also found little favour with the monarchists. Centralism was completely antithetical to the Basque nationalist cause, the people pushing for greater autonomy of the Basque region. This is the key reason why Phalangists eventually targeted the Basque country with such ferocity that they did, in spite of the Pontiff and Rome urging Franco to avoid belligerent action against the Catholic Basque population explicitly. We turn back to Franco. On the 1st of October 1936, a decree was made stating that the Generalissimo, the Caudillo, would assume all powers of the new state, making him leader of the rebellion formally, if it was in any doubt, at this point. By April 1937, the single Falangist party essentially came into being, and in the words of Nigel Townsend, once again, the dictatorship that would dominate much of 20th century Spain thereafter was already in the making at this point. Come February 1938, the Francoist government was formed. But that same day, the 1st of October in 1936, the Cortes of the Republic approved a statute for greater autonomy for Vizcaya, Guipúzcoa and Álava, the three provinces that make up the Basque Comunidad to this day. 459,000 people voted for this motion, 14,000 voted against. So a sweeping majority for those that did indeed vote. The Republic needed to keep Catholic Basques on their side in the Civil War, and that is why this statute for greater autonomy was presented to the Basque people. That firmed them up as Republican supporters, even though many of them were practicing Catholics. Navarra, across the border, culturally Basque, but politically separate, voted against this motion. Navarra was always the centre of Carlism during the Carlist Wars of the 19th century. It was always the centre, the key area of this ideology, and it had little appetite also for a republic. And therefore, Navarra was a seat of support for the Phalangists, for the rebels, and for Franco. He later rewarded this region as it became the only one with a degree of political autonomy during his rule in the dictatorship. October the 7th, 6 days later, the 32-year-old Basque Nationalist Party leader and mayor of Getxo, Aguirre, was elevated to the position of lehendakari, the leader of the Basque government, at 32 years old. Can you imagine? He took the oath under the oak tree of Guernica, the Guernicaco Arbola. And the words he said in euskera, taking the oath, were, "Humble before God, standing on Basque soil in remembrance of Basque ancestors, under the tree of Guernica, I swear to faithfully fulfill my commission." That translation comes from A Basque History of the World by Mark Kulansky. Yet during this event, as Aguirre took the mantle for leading the Basque government in a particularly tense time, there was already a lot of panic and anticipation of retaliatory Falangist action as a consequence of the Basque region being given more autonomy from the Republic. Vizcaya was a Republican stronghold. Prior to the attacks in 1937, its population was about 500,000. The nationalist rebels needed that symbolic victory to boost morale after having failed to take Madrid, and Germany wanted control over the iron deposits and industry in Vizcaya, in Biscay province. Thus, between the 24th and 26th of March 1937, General Emilio Mola, together with the German General Hugo Speer, came together to plot the campaign against Biscay province. Mola and Speer did not get on. Theirs was not a harmonious relationship. The latter was very unimpressed with the former's poor understanding of how to deploy what was essentially the world's best attack air fleet at the time. Speer explained time and time again how air attack could be used to break morale ahead of infantry arrival to mop up any loose ends on the ground. It is a very mountainous region. Just rolling tanks across it won't work, they will get stuck. Thus, the idea was that Red Beret Carlist troops, the Spaniards from Navarra, would lead the campaign on the ground against Vizcaya, supported by Italian and German infantry, with the aircraft loaned to them by Mussolini and by Hitler to do the bulk of the heavy lifting up front. thus 12,000 troops on the ground following some of the best attack aircraft in the world, which would be the first strike against Biscay province. Burgos airstrip nearby was under Franco's jurisdiction. That's where he was housing the bombers of this fleet. And Vitoria in Alaba, that was where the lighter fighter aircraft lended to him by Germany and Italy was being housed. Thus, two air bases nearby meant that planes used in the assault could complete multiple attacks in a single day. Go to the destination, drop off the payload, come back, refuel with military hardware, with bombs and with fuel, and go do it again a couple hours later. This was a huge factor in the way in which plans were drafted against the Basque region. Furthermore, Spela and Mora were fully aware of the poverty of aircraft available to the Republican forces in northern Spain at the time. They only had 6 fighters and 7 bombers available, and all were outdated. Thus, Spela and Mora knew full well that they were not going to come up against a great deal of resistance in the air, if any at all, during their campaign. In the first year of the war, rebel insurgents had learned bombing tactics designed specifically to topple buildings and sap morale. Gas use, what had been used in World War I, was not so effective in Spain, but incendiary bombs, things designed to fall onto a town and set fire to it, were much more effective at causing widespread destruction and panic and terror on very densely populated Spanish cities, which they tend to be, as I'm sure you're aware. In the Basque Country in particular, the small towns, all made of wood and stone as primary building materials. On the 31st of March, after the plan had more or less been drawn up and the Condor Legion was ready, Mola broadcast directly to the civilian population of Biscaya province. He dropped leaflets and pamphlets from his planes on which were written the following words: "A proclamation to the people of Euskadi. I have decided to terminate rapidly the war in the north. Those not guilty of murders who surrender their arms will have their lives and property saved. But if submission is not immediate, I will raise Vizcaya to the ground, beginning with the industries of war. I have the means to do so." Those were the words distributed out of a plane on pamphlets to the people below in Republican Vizcaya. I have seen that same translation in various sources, so I think we can trust it. On that same day, March the 31st, there was a artillery and aerial attack on the town of Durango. At 7:20 in the morning, it lasted 30 minutes. 258 civilians were killed in Durango, but these were mostly high explosives. They were not incendiary bombs like they would be in Guernica later on. Franco's office claimed no responsibility to the international press for this attack. He said that the communists among the Republican ranks must have been the ones that performed it, because many churches were hit, which is something he claims he would not have done. On the 25th of April, 1937, Eibar was bombed. This town was the home of several factories producing arms for the Republicans, but unlike Durango, incendiary bombs were used in Eibar. These contained thermite, a small powder made of metal that burns very, very quickly and very hot and is a light payload. Therefore, a quick acid test for the Condor Legion and for Franco's bombers. They filled these shells with thermite that would drop, an ignition would light it, that would then light the magnesium casing around it, which would burn for 15 minutes and would be almost impossible to extinguish. Therefore, this had the maximum effect on largely wooden structures, given that the objective was to burn down buildings and terrify people in the process. The next day, April 26th, 1937. It was a Monday, which meant in Guernica, market day. It being a small town of the hills, people come down with their wagons, with their carts, selling cheese, milk, meats, fruit, you name it, wine, probably alcohol, liquors. The newly appointed administrator of Guernica, Francisco Lascano, he had cancelled the market efficiently. He's saying it was too close to the front line, people were at risk, but many out-of-towners came to Guernica anyway. And at 4:40 p.m, one of the world's first deliberate firebombings of a civilian target began. The church bell rang to warn of an incoming aerial threat. It noticed, coming in shallow over the hills, the fleet of foreign aircraft. Those were 4 Heinkel 111s capable of carrying 3,300 pounds of bombs in one journey, 23 Junker Ju-52s, 3 Savoia Marchetti S-81s, 1 Dornier Do-17S. This was capable of carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs in a single trip, and this was the first of the fleet to drop a bomb on Guernica, according to eyewitnesses. 12 Fiat CR-32s, and 1 Messerschmitt Bf-109. There were a small number of Republican soldiers in Guernica the day when it happened, but the bulk of people in Guernica that day were just civilians going about their everyday business. They ran to take shelter anywhere they could the moment the planes rolled in. The bombing continued until 7:45 at night. 70% of the buildings in Guernica were reportedly damaged beyond usability. The South African-born British journalist George Steer claims that the Tree of Guernica was not damaged during the campaign. 3 days later, Franco's troops arrived on foot in Guernica. They initially denied the attack. They first tried to say that poor fog that day and lack of foreign aircraft nearby meant it could not have happened. And then they tried to claim that the Basques had accidentally dynamited their own city, leading to the widespread fire. Franco's forces never released any documentation on the firebombing of Guernica, therefore we can never know the accurate death toll of what happened that day. The Basque government claims that the death toll stood at 1,645, and again that comes from Mark Kulansky's book, The Basque History of the World, but Nigel Townsend puts the death toll at a more conservative 200 to 300. In June 1937, Bilbao fell to the rebels. In October, Franco's forces controlled the entire northern coast of Spain. Come April 1938, the rebels had gotten to the Mediterranean at the Ebro River, thus splitting Republican Spain in half, one part in Barcelona, one part in Valencia. A Republican revolt in July 1938 failed. Through these final 2 years, Franco continued his war on attrition while purging the population he had captured of potential threats to his rule. Spain was finally conquered on April the 1st, 1939, and the Spanish War concluded. It appears that the Basque campaign, the attack on Biscay province, changed the tide of the Spanish Civil War. Stalin quietly began to withdraw his support for the Spanish Republic. 4 journalists were in the area, 4 international journalists, 4 foreigners, were near Guernica when the attack happened. 1 was Belgian, 3 were British, including George Steer, who we already previously mentioned. The 4 of them interviewed survivors in Guernica in spite of the rebel soldier presence in the town thereafter. And it is George Steer's journalism that we have to thank for having as much detail that we do about what happened that day in Guernica. His quote, "The object of the bombardment was seemingly the demoralisation of the civil population and the destruction of the cradle of the Basque race." The Times of London and the New York Times both ran his article on the bombing 2 days later, on the 28th of April 1937, and the outcry among the readers was enormous. The outcry at the merciless attack that Franco had conducted against unarmed civilians primarily. But another point struck, in particular, the British readers of what he wrote. They became aware for the first time of the new military capabilities on display that the Germans in particular had lended Franco. And in the second half of the 1930s, when Germany was armouring itself, when it was expanding, when it was flexing its muscles in the direction of the people it perceived to be its enemies, this was a concern for Britain, and the foresight they had was well warranted, because what was seen in Guernica was to be the fate of economic hubs, places of industry, port cities like Hull, where I come from, which I'll only mention because I mention Hull whenever I can. People saw what had happened in Guernica and how easy it had been to destroy from above using German planes, and they realised this is probably going to be a defining feature of the conflict coming soon, if one happens, which of course it did. Prior to that point, the British government had maintained a policy of non-interference in the Spanish Civil War, but so strong was the unified British public response against the combined Axis bombing of Guernica that 4,000 Basque children were evacuated to the UK via Southampton, a port city on the south coast, again part of the fabled connection between Bilbao and Southampton, two twin cities. These children received a very warm welcome, and banners and streamers were set out in the city when they arrived to help welcome them. In France, the media response was a bit different. At the end of 1936, obviously a few months prior to the bombing, the coverage in the national press, in the newspapers and periodicals circulating in France, had kind of died down about the Spanish Civil War. The same old stories were not generating much interest among the French readership at that time. French journalist Louis Delapré, he became tired of his newspaper, Paris Soir. He was tired of the heavy editing and censorship of the pieces he was sending them about the rebel bombing of Madrid, where he was based in the final months of 1936. On the 4th of December, Delapré sent his final message to Paris Soir from Madrid. He said, "You have not published half my articles. That is your right. But I would have thought your friendship would have spared me useless work. For 3 weeks, I have been getting up at 5 a.m. in order to give you the news for your first editions. You have made me work for the waste paper basket. Thanks. I am taking a plane on Sunday unless I meet the fate of Guy de Travasset, which would be a good thing, wouldn't it? For thus you would have your martyr also. In the meantime, I am sending nothing more. It is not worth the trouble. The massacre of 100 Spanish children is less interesting than a sigh from Miss Simpson, the royal whore." That quote comes from Richard Rhodes in his book Hell and Good Company. On the 8th of December, he did indeed board an Air France plane chartered by the French government, but at an altitude of about 10,000 feet close to Madrid. Historical archives suggest a Soviet plane attacked. It crash-landed. Delapré initially survived with severe abdominal injuries and was transferred to a convent clinic in Guadalajara for treatment, but he succumbed to his injuries on the 11th of that month, a Friday. Although Paris Soir did not publish Delapré's articles about the bombing campaigns of Madrid as much as he would have liked, somebody, and it is not known who to this day, had access to the uncut articles pre-censor in Madrid. This source leaked them to a rival French newspaper, L'Humanité, which, if my understanding is correct, this was very sympathetic to the communist cause at the time in France. Far from just publishing the late Delapré's stories about rebel insurgent bombings in the Spanish capital, L'Humanité also prepared a report on Paris Soir's suppression of the journalistic intentions of Delapré about civilian killings on behalf of the rebel insurgency. When this dropped, there was outrage, as you can imagine, among much of the Parisian population. On the 8th of January 1937, a pamphlet was widely distributed called Bombs Over Madrid, and it was reprinted once again in L'Humanité the next day. And one reader of L'Humanité in 1937 was a certain Pablo Picasso. We turn our attention to Mr. Picasso. In September 1936, he had accepted the role as honorary director of the Prado Museum in Madrid. Again, this was just after the outbreak of the war. Previously, he had not really expressed any partisan political sentiment or leanings, but he accepted the role without much consideration. It carried with it very little practical additional responsibility. It was primarily a symbolic act. He'd taken a hiatus from painting from 1935, after having consistently painted for hundreds of pieces per year, going back for a long time. His former wife, Olga Koklova, and that's an easy name to remember because it looks a little bit like Koklova, but make of that what you will. Olga Koklova, she was a Ukrainian ballerina. She had previously discovered and tolerated his affair with a mistress, Maria-Therese Walter, in 1932, but then when she had revealed to Pablo she was pregnant, that's Marie-Therese, Pablo decided that he would divorce Olga in that moment, and she duly sought legal action against him personally to protect her assets and financial interests. The settlement was costly to him, it was expensive, it was a big one, she did quite well out on the engagement. And the reason that he stopped painting in 1935, the reason why he took a hiatus, many people believe he stopped painting so as to generate less value that would fall directly into her estate. As of 1936, he began to paint slowly again as war broke out. The knowledge of the bombing of civilians in Madrid, with Italian troops moving toward Malaga, where he was born, he would have been acutely aware of this at the end of 1936. And in 1937, we see him once again expressing himself in the form of lurid abstract sketches and paintings. The most frequent subjects were indeed Dora Maar, who was a painter, and another conquest of his at the time, let's say, and Marie-Thérèse. The two of them were often featured symbolically in many of the works he was doing in the beginning of 1937, but many of the subjects he was painting in this era, in early 1937, were again deliberately grotesque, distressing or unpleasant. So even if he was painting one of his ladies, he would go out of his way to make it an unpleasant, a disturbing, a distressing image to look at. In January of 1937, a delegation from the official Spanish Republican government approached Picasso in Paris. These included the Catalan architect Josep Lluís Sert, novelist and playwright Max Aub, and Luis Aragon, who was a French poet, novelist, and a friend of Picasso. They approached Pablo Picasso directly to request a piece for the Spanish pavilion at the Paris World Fair to open mid-July that year. The piece was intended to represent Republican Spain through the eyes of Picasso to the world, to anybody attending. But otherwise, the content was entirely at Pablo Picasso's discretion. He could paint whatever he liked, whatever he saw fit, as long as he felt it represented Republican Spain in 1937. Completely out of character, Pablo Picasso madly agreed to the deadline, something he never did. Thus, the next months, he continued to paint his two mistresses, Marie-Thérèse and the painter-photographer Dora Maar, as we've discussed. And by April, he knew the dimensions of the final piece he was to make, but he didn't have a subject yet. He didn't know what he was going to paint. And by this time, he was already exploring motifs in his sketches that would become part of the Guernica painting, even though he didn't know it. Nobody knew at the time. In that month also, Franco had renewed his bombing campaign of the civilians in Madrid. Now, Paris Soir, having done the lesson, and L'Humanité, on the 19th of April, published reports of Franco and the rebel bombing of Madrid. The gruesome details of the bombing of helpless civilians seemed to catch Picasso's attention far more than military engagements of regular soldiers, of actual soldiers. Louis Delapré's pamphlet Bombs Over Madrid was reprinted and redistributed in Paris in April, and one striking photo inside was of an electric flashlight illuminating a woman holding her dead child killed in the bombing campaign. And that image, a woman in desperation, would become the key figure, the key subject of the Guernica painting. On the 28th of April, after the Guernica bombing, the L'Humanité ran a front page article dedicated to that event. Ce Soir, an evening newspaper in Paris, published photos of the event on the 30th. On May the 1st, and this comes from pablopicasso.org, on this date, that's when the website claims Picasso's original idea was scrapped, and by now he had a clear concept in his mind that he was going to represent in paint the Guernica bombing. Dora Maar, she had been renting a spacious attic for Picasso at the number 7 Rue des Grands Augustins. Forgive me for my terrible French, it's not a language I speak. She'd been renting that attic for him for months, but the Spanish Republican government then leased it for him for his use only, to work on the Guernica painting for the fair. It was in this attic, at this address, for the first 10 days of May, Picasso explored his ideas through his hands, sketches, drafts, little scribbles. On the 11th, he set up the canvas. He was ready to begin. It said it was so large he needed long handle brushes and a stepladder to be able to get to the very top, and he became obsessive with it. He told a committee, who when they came to visit him, that they would need to come take it off him when they were ready, because he didn't trust that he would ever say to himself, "It's finished, I can stop." On the 28th of May, a transaction was made for the painting, so the actual purchase by the Spanish Republican government of the piece of art for 150,000 French francs, which about today's money apparently is more or less $100,000. A lot of money to pay for something that he says he was happy to donate himself, but the reason why they proceeded with the transaction was to legally confirm the ownership of the painting. The finished Guernica piece was brought to the pavilion in late June. The official date I could not find. That, I think, is information lost to the past. And the painting was exhibited at the Spanish pavilion of the Paris World Fair in June in 1937. I'll end this passage with what I think is an apocryphal quote, but I love it. A German officer in Vichy, France, in Paris, asked Picasso, who was still living there, who was still very vocal of his opposition to what Mussolini, Hitler and Franco had done in Guernica. This German officer asked Picasso if he'd seen the bombing. And Picasso's reported answer was, no, but you did. I'm sure it's apocryphal, but I love the idea of Picasso's stubborn attitude, staying strong even in the darkest days of Vichy France. The afterlife. The Paris World Fair closed in November 1937. Guernica proceeded to have its own world tour. It went to Scandinavia, to England, back to France again, and then to New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it would stay for many years until 1981, when it moved back to Spain upon Picasso's wish of it doing so after the country became democratic once again. It garnered a lot of sympathy for the victims of Franco's aggression in Spain on the Republican side, on behalf of not just of Picasso, but of anybody anti-war and also anti-Falangist at the time around the world. In 1974, in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, Guernica was defaced by an artist and quote-unquote anti-war activist known as Tony Shafrazi. He defaced it with red spray paint. Why, of all paintings on display around the world, this would be the one that anti-war activists would choose to deface makes no sense to me whatsoever, but hey, Shafrazi was arrested and he was charged with criminal mischief. The painting itself was cleaned very, very quickly. It suffered no long-lasting permanent damage as a consequence of Shafrazi's actions. Restored, cleaned, Shafrazi was arrested and charged, and in 1981, as we said, it moved back to Spain, to Madrid, to the Reina Sofia, the museum across town from the Prado, which Pablo Picasso had previously been the honorary director of. In 1970, the Franco government finally admitted it had conducted the air bombing campaign of Guernica. It was until 1999 that the Spanish courts passed a statute confirming that Franco had lied about the incident to the Spanish public. And it was in 1998, a year before, that the German government apologised formally to the Basque people for having participated in the firebombing of Guernica that cost so many lives of civilians who were not engaged directly in the conflict. There we go, guys. That is the timeline of the Guernica painting, one of 20th century Spain's most important painting, I would argue the most important painting, and the context in which it was created. Like I said, a very, very serious one. We're going to finish on a high. Spanish recommendation of the week, our final regular segment of every episode. No surprise whatsoever, I'm recommending you go visit the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, one of the best art collections you'll find anywhere in the world. And it's in Madrid, a city we haven't actually given that much attention to so far on this podcast, so I feel I should. You're also going to go and see Guernica itself if you visit the Reina Sofia. Go, 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 go. I've been James Brufrey. Thank you so much for listening. If you've gotten this far, please do give us a like, a comment, a follow, all the rest of it. It really helps us out with the algorithm wherever you are listening. Thank you very much once again. And because this has been such a serious episode, I'm going to say, DJ, press play on that funky outro music once more. Thanks, guys. Take care. from November 1937, in 3 months, Italy... ¿Y qué fue? No existe nada.